What would drive a son to murder the very people who brought him into the world? To destroy the ones who loved him unconditionally, who bent every rule, who sacrificed everything to save him? It sounds like the kind of story that belongs in a psychological thriller, a Hollywood script carefully constructed for maximum tension and emotion. But this is not fiction. This is the Reiner tragedy. A horror so intimate, so raw, that it exposes the dark undercurrents lurking beneath even the most seemingly perfect families. And now, for the first time, the FBI has released footage that captures Rob Reiner in his own home, in the hours before his life was stolen. Footage that, according to investigators, may hold clues that no one outside the family was ever meant to see. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Rob Reiner, celebrated actor, legendary director, household name in Hollywood. He made people laugh, cry, cheer, and cry again. From iconic films to memorable TV appearances, his life was a story of success, charm, and influence. To the world, he was untouchable, larger than life. But behind the glitz, the cameras, the red carpets, the family home in Santa Monica held a very different reality. A reality where fear, resentment, and violence had quietly taken root. Where the man who had given so much love was about to experience the unimaginable. His wife, Michelle, was no less devoted. A mother who spent decades nurturing not only her children, but the delicate balance of a household strained by one son's struggles. She believed in family above all else. She believed that love could heal wounds, that patience could overcome chaos, and that nothing, not even her own exhaustion, could break the bond she had worked so hard to build. But what happens when love is no longer enough? When the very person you protect becomes the instrument of destruction? That question would shatter the Reiners' lives in the most devastating way. Nick Reiner, 32, the son at the center of this storm, was troubled from a young age. A charismatic, sometimes charming presence, yes, but his charm masked a darkness that grew heavier with each passing year. Addiction, violent outbursts, resentment toward authority. All of it simmered beneath the surface. And it's easy, in hindsight, to look for warning signs. The incident in 2018, when he destroyed his family's guest house while under the influence of cocaine, is just one glaring example. But for Rob and Michelle, it was always about the possibility of redemption. Always about the hope that their son could be saved, that he could be guided back to the family they cherished. The family's dynamic was complex. Nick was the anomaly. One troubled child among four siblings, the others stable, accomplished, seemingly untouched by the chaos that followed him wherever he went. And yet, his presence consumed the family's energy. Who got the most attention? Nick. Who took all their energy? Nick. And who did they baby the most? Nick. These are the words of a close family friend, describing a household where love and frustration were locked in a delicate, volatile dance. Rob, ever the practical, stand-on-your-own father, was patient with Nick in a way he wasn't with anyone else. He recognized Nick's struggles as an illness, a sickness, something beyond mere behavior. But that patience came at a cost. The siblings, the ones who had always played by the rules, bore the emotional weight of Nick's problems. Resentment quietly festered, bonds frayed, and a quiet tension filled every corner of the Reiner household. And then came the night that changed everything. The police reports, the media coverage, the heart-wrenching interviews, all point to the same horrific scenario. Nick allegedly waited until his parents were asleep, until the moment of vulnerability was absolute, and then he struck. He stabbed them to death, slitting both of their throats as they lay in bed. The symbolism is almost cinematic in its cruelty, shutting them up permanently, ending the voices that had guided, loved, and disciplined him. A savagery that the world struggles to comprehend, yet one that was, to those closest to the family, tragically consistent with Nick's history of violence. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Nick was found near a Santa Monica hotel, a scene of blood everywhere, shower, bed, floor. The sheer brutality of the crime shocked even those who knew of his violent tendencies. It was Romy, one of his sisters, who reportedly contacted the authorities, expressing her fear that her brother had committed the unthinkable. The family's worst nightmares had come to life, and the shockwaves would ripple far beyond the walls of their home. Hollywood, too, reacted in disbelief. The Reiners were beloved figures, admired for their work, respected for their professionalism and warmth. And now, the world was confronted with a tragedy that was all too human, all too relatable in its underlying pain. How often do families fracture under the weight of one troubled individual? How often do love and patience collide with uncontrollable darkness? And how often are the consequences permanent, irreversible, and horrifying? Yet even in the midst of tragedy, the story is not just about violence. It's about addiction, obsession, and the fragile nature of family loyalty. It's about a father who tried to do everything right, a mother who believed in the healing power of love, and siblings who watched from the sidelines, powerless, as their family was consumed from within. It's about the things we hope we will never have to face, and yet, sometimes, we do. And now, the FBI footage, the last hours of Rob Reiner's life, captured inside his own home, offers a glimpse into the moments that preceded the unthinkable. It's a haunting window, a record of normalcy that would soon be obliterated by chaos. What does it show? Did it capture subtle signs of tension, warnings that the family missed? Or is it simply a record of innocence moments before horror? The questions linger, demanding answers that may never fully come. As we prepare to dive deeper into this story, it's important to remember what's at stake. This is not a tale of scandal or sensationalism for entertainment's sake. This is a story of real people, real pain, and a reality that Hollywood rarely shows. It's about love, failure, and the consequences of ignoring warning signs that sometimes scream too loudly to be silenced. And it's about understanding how someone could go from being a child in need to a figure capable of unspeakable violence. What we will explore is a story in layers. The public face of Rob Reiner, the hidden struggles within his household, the complicated personality of Nick, the fractured sibling relationships, the psychological analysis of motives, the forensic discoveries, the FBI footage, the aftermath, the trial, and finally, the reflection on what lessons can be drawn from this unimaginable tragedy. Every piece, every detail, builds toward understanding a human story that is heartbreaking, terrifying, and compelling in ways few tragedies ever are. But even as we unpack these layers, one question remains at the forefront. Could this have been prevented? Could intervention, awareness, or even simple vigilance have altered the course of events? Or was this an inevitability, a collision of personal demons, familial strain, and human fragility that no one could stop? As we dig deeper, the answers will not come easily. The complexity of the Reiner tragedy will challenge assumptions, evoke emotions, and confront the audience with realities they may prefer not to face. By the time we reach the end, you will have seen the tragedy from every angle. The father who loved too much, the mother who tried everything, the son who broke free of all boundaries in the darkest possible way, and the siblings left to piece together a family shattered beyond repair. You will witness how fame and fortune could not protect a family from its own internal storms. And, perhaps most haunting of all, you will see the final moments of a man beloved by millions, moments captured on FBI cameras, minutes before everything changed forever. What did the Reiner household look like when the cameras were off? When the Hollywood lights faded, the red carpets were rolled up, and the world's eyes turned elsewhere? To the casual observer, it might have seemed like any other loving family home. Laughter echoing through sunlit hallways, family dinners punctuated by jokes and stories, the comforting rhythm of everyday life. But beneath that polished surface, tension was simmering, subtle but persistent. In the Reiner family, love and conflict coexisted, often uneasily, and the presence of one son, Nick, complicated everything. Rob Reiner was a man who demanded excellence from himself and those around him. He was direct, ambitious, and endlessly creative, traits that fueled his career as an actor and director. But in the home, he attempted to balance discipline with compassion, structure with understanding. His wife Michelle acted as the glue, the emotional stabilizer, the one who often softened Rob's sharper edges. She had a warmth and patience that many admired, yet even she was stretched thin by the unpredictability of her family life. Together, They tried to navigate a household where one child's problems overshadowed the harmony of the rest. Nick Reiner, the family's youngest or middle child depending on the source, was known early on for his charisma and energy. He had a spark, a magnetism that drew people in. But it was a spark that could ignite chaos. Friends and neighbors remembered moments of charm abruptly replaced by volatility, a temper that flared without warning. It wasn't simply teenage rebellion. It was a pattern that persisted into adulthood, fueled by substance abuse, untreated mental health issues, and a simmering resentment toward his parents. The family tried repeatedly to intervene, to provide guidance and therapy, to redirect him from self-destructive behavior. But each attempt often failed, leaving wounds that would grow deeper over time. The siblings who were not Nick lived in the shadows of this turmoil. Romy and the other two children, whose identities remained somewhat private, respecting their privacy, experienced the indirect effects of Nick's behavior. Love was abundant in the Reiner family, yes, but attention was finite. As their parents devoted energy to Nick, the other children felt overlooked, neglected, and at times resentful. The dynamic was subtle yet corrosive. Each sibling loved Nick, but also carried frustration for the disproportionate attention he commanded. The sense of imbalance was reinforced by repeated incidents, arguments, interventions, and outright chaos brought home by Nick that drew the parents' focus and emotional bandwidth away from the other children. Family friends described the home as a microcosm of tension and contradiction. Rob was practical to a fault, they said, a man who wanted his children to stand on their own, but made exceptions for Nick because he saw the struggles as illness, not defiance. Michelle was endlessly patient, a mother who attempted to shield the family from the full force of Nick's volatility while still nurturing her other children. But the effort required to maintain this delicate equilibrium was enormous. Conversations in the home were often fraught with underlying stress. Holidays, dinners, even casual gatherings carried an invisible weight, the constant awareness that at any moment, Nick could explode, disrupt, or demand attention. It wasn't that Rob and Michelle were permissive, far from it. They set boundaries and attempted interventions, from therapy sessions to careful monitoring of Nick's activities. Yet boundaries often failed against a force they could not control. Nick's addictions, his anger, his deep-seated resentment, pushed past every structure the parents tried to enforce. In many ways, their love became a double-edged sword. It provided support and protection, but it also enabled continued destructive behavior. The family's effort to nurture Nick, paradoxically, fed into the cycle of dependence and volatility. Neighbors recall the house as quiet, yet occasionally chaotic. There were moments of normalcy. The smell of Michelle's cooking drifting through the rooms, laughter from the siblings, Rob practicing lines or discussing film projects. And then there were the interruptions. Loud arguments, slammed doors, the aftermath of impulsive behavior. For the people living closest to the Reiners, there was a constant tension between admiration for the family and a subtle understanding that all was not well behind closed doors. Nick's behavior was not limited to verbal outbursts or emotional manipulation. Reports suggest that he had moments of physical aggression long before the ultimate tragedy. The 2018 incident in which he destroyed the family's guest house while under the influence of cocaine is one example. But family friends also hint at smaller, recurring episodes, smashing objects, yelling fits, threats that kept the household on edge. These were incidents that would have destabilized any family. But in the Reiner household, they became part of the background, something that everyone adapted to, until, ultimately, it proved impossible to contain. Siblings' experiences were equally telling. They witnessed a pattern of attention being funneled toward Nick. When one child requires extraordinary care, the others, no matter how capable or loving, often feel invisible. In the Reiner family, this dynamic had subtle but significant emotional consequences. Frustration turned to resentment. Love was mixed with guilt. Guilt for feeling frustration toward a brother who needed help. Guilt for needing attention themselves. Guilt for knowing their parents' love for Nick was unwavering. This cocktail of emotions built a complex, fragile family structure that could not withstand prolonged strain. The parents' approach to Nick can be described as a mix of compassion and desperation. Rob, Ever the analytical and decisive father, saw patterns in Nick's behavior, tried to guide him, but struggled to balance firmness with protection. Michelle, empathetic and nurturing, attempted to shield the family from the full impact of Nick's instability while still confronting his issues. Together, they crafted a household that was as stable as possible, but by necessity, it revolved around crisis management. The other children became secondary participants in this ongoing drama, absorbing lessons about caution, diplomacy, and avoidance while witnessing the destructive power of unchecked addiction and resentment. Even small daily routines were influenced by Nick's presence. Meals, family outings, even casual conversations had an unspoken layer of tension. The other siblings were careful to avoid triggering arguments. Rob and Michelle constantly negotiated boundaries, attempting to manage both Nick's impulses and the emotional health of the family as a whole. Over time, the stress accumulated, leaving cracks in relationships that seemed unnoticeable to outsiders but were deeply felt within the household. And then there were the moments of contrast. The moments when the family appeared idyllic, when laughter filled the halls, when Nick's charm shone through and reminded everyone why they tried so hard to support him. These moments created a cruel tension, a promise of normalcy that was repeatedly broken. For the siblings, each fleeting glimpse of harmony heightened the emotional stakes, creating hope and despair in rapid succession. For the parents, these moments reinforced the need to persevere, to continue interventions, to maintain faith that their son could find stability. The Reiner household was, in many ways, a pressure cooker. Years of addiction, resentment, imbalance, and attempted interventions coalesced into an environment where normalcy and chaos existed side by side. Every day was a negotiation, every interaction a delicate balance between care and caution. Friends outside the family often saw only the facade, the successful father, the devoted mother, the charming children. But inside, the emotional landscape was fraught with tension, a landscape that would ultimately erupt in tragedy. By the time of the murders, the foundation of the household had been eroded by years of strain. The parents' love, while unwavering, had been stretched beyond its limits. The siblings' patience, while remarkable, had been worn thin by constant vigilance and emotional sacrifice. And Nick, a man who had grown into adulthood still grappling with addiction and resentment, had become a force that the family could no longer contain. What happened inside that home on the night of the murders was the tragic culmination of years of imbalance, frustration, and unaddressed trauma. The Reiner family, like many families with a troubled child, had tried everything within their power to maintain love and stability. But sometimes, love alone is not enough. Sometimes, the patterns of dysfunction run too deep, and the consequences are irreversible. And yet, even as we recount this history, the question remains: could anyone have seen the warning signs clearly enough to prevent the catastrophe? Could Rob and Michelle, despite their years of experience and devotion, have predicted the moment when chaos would finally consume their home? As we delve deeper into this story, the answer becomes both more complex and more unsettling. What was Nick Reiner like before the darkness took hold? Before the addictions, before the violence, before the night that would forever scar the Reiner family? To understand the tragedy that would unfold, we must look back to the beginning, to a childhood marked by contradictions, a boy of charm and chaos, brilliance and volatility, promise and warning signs. Nick's earliest years were, in many ways, typical for a child of a successful Hollywood family. Rob and Michelle provided comfort, opportunities, and a household filled with encouragement. Nick's siblings, too, enjoyed a relatively stable upbringing, with rules, routines, and the security of attentive parents. Yet, even in these early years, Nick exhibited behaviors that hinted at a complexity beyond ordinary childhood mischief. Teachers would remark on his charisma, the ability to draw people into his orbit, to command attention effortlessly. But behind that charm, there were flashes of defiance, sudden outbursts, and moments of frustration that seemed disproportionate for a child his age. Nick was intensely intelligent, which was both a gift and a challenge. He could absorb lessons quickly, understand complex ideas, and charm adults with his insights. But intelligence, when combined with impulsivity, can create a dangerous mix. His parents, recognizing both the potential and the volatility, tried to guide him carefully. They encouraged his talents, offered structure, and sought professional help when needed. Yet the very traits that made Nick remarkable, his intensity, his sensitivity, his drive, also made him vulnerable to frustration, anger, and self-destructive tendencies. It wasn't just the behaviors that concerned the family. It was the emotional undercurrents. Nick had a restless energy, a difficulty managing disappointment, and a tendency to interpret minor setbacks as personal betrayals. Early incidents of aggression, throwing objects, yelling at siblings, or lashing out at authority figures, were often dismissed as phases or adolescence. But the Reiners, like many loving parents, may have underestimated the persistence and escalation of these traits. They saw flashes of normalcy, moments when Nick could behave responsibly and sweetly. Even within the sibling dynamic, Nick's differences were pronounced. His siblings were comparatively stable, obedient, and high-achieving. They followed rules, completed schoolwork, and navigated social situations with relative ease. Nick, on the other hand, demanded attention, questioned authority, and often resisted boundaries. This imbalance created subtle tension. While the other children excelled and earned praise, Nick required extraordinary effort and patience from their parents. Over time, this dynamic planted seeds of resentment among the siblings, who felt both love for their brother and frustration at the disproportionate attention he received. Nick's adolescence intensified the warning signs. He began experimenting with substances, alcohol, drugs, and behaviors that would later become part of his pattern of self-destruction. What might have been minor youthful indiscretions in another child became signals of a deeper struggle. Nick's behavior was not isolated. It was consistent, escalating, and increasingly difficult for the family to manage. Early attempts at intervention, counseling, structured schedules, open communication, met with resistance, denial, or temporary compliance. Each episode served as both a lesson and a warning, a chance for the family to recalibrate, but also a demonstration of the challenge they were facing. Friends and neighbors recall Nick as magnetic yet unpredictable. He could be engaging and humorous one moment, aggressive or manipulative the next. These contrasts created a sense of instability in the household that was difficult to manage. The Reiners, as loving and attentive parents, were caught in a cycle. They oscillated between patience, discipline, and intervention, never entirely certain which approach would work and which would backfire. The uncertainty weighed heavily on the family, leaving emotional scars that would persist for years. Nick's early interactions outside the family also reflected his complexity. In school, he showed flashes of creativity and intelligence, but struggled with authority figures. Teachers would praise his talent, but express concern about his temperament, impulsivity, or occasional outbursts. Sports, clubs, and extracurricular activities offered opportunities to channel energy constructively, yet Nick often rebelled against structure, seeking independence and testing boundaries. These behaviors, while not uncommon for teenagers, were amplified by his intensity, creating a pattern that his parents and siblings would spend years attempting to manage. There were moments when hope seemed real. Nick had periods of engagement, success, and cooperation. Perhaps he excelled at a creative project, bonded with a sibling, or followed a set of rules for a short period. These moments reinforced the family's commitment to helping him, strengthening their resolve that with enough love, guidance, and patience, he could navigate life successfully. But as with many cases of chronic behavioral challenges, these glimpses of normalcy were often followed by regression, episodes of anger, or destructive behavior, reinforcing the cycle of concern and intervention. By the time Nick reached adulthood, the early warning signs had evolved into patterns of addiction, violence, and resentment. Substance abuse became more frequent, aggressive tendencies more pronounced, and defiance of authority more calculated. The Reiners, having devoted years to interventions, found themselves navigating a son who was no longer just a child in need, but a fully grown adult capable of making destructive choices. Their attempts to guide him had to shift from nurturing to protective, balancing care with the realities of risk, harm, and legal implications. The family dynamic also intensified with age. Nick's siblings had grown into young adults, seeking independence, pursuing careers, and building their own lives. Yet the gravitational pull of Nick's challenges drew parental focus, requiring Rob and Michelle to divert attention and resources, often at the expense of the siblings' emotional needs. Sibling relationships were strained, jealousy, resentment, and guilt mingled in complex ways. Each sibling loved Nick, yet struggled with the disproportionate attention he demanded. Each felt a tension between empathy and frustration, between loyalty and self-preservation. The seeds of tragedy were visible, if only in hindsight. Patterns of addiction, emotional volatility, and sibling tension created a household vulnerable to crisis. Nick's charm and intelligence masked the deeper instability within him, delaying recognition of the escalating danger. Rob and Michelle's devotion, while admirable, may have inadvertently enabled behaviors that ultimately contributed to the catastrophic outcome. And the siblings, while resilient, bore the quiet emotional burden of a home dominated by the turbulence of one child's struggles. Yet there was no malice, no deliberate neglect. The Reiners acted out of love, hope, and a belief in the potential for redemption. They tried therapy, guidance, and intervention. They celebrated successes, offered forgiveness, and sought balance. But even the best-intentioned parents can be overwhelmed by the combination of untreated addiction, unresolved resentment, and escalating behavioral issues. The trajectory that led to the murders was shaped over decades, a complex interplay of nurture, environment, and personal choice. Even in these early years, there were moments that foreshadowed the danger. Aggressive outbursts, substance use, and manipulative behaviors hinted at patterns that would intensify. Friends and family noticed inconsistencies. The boy who could be warm, charming, and intelligent one moment could become volatile, destructive, and dangerous the next. The warning signs were there, but like many families grappling with complex behavioral issues, the hope for change often overshadowed the need for preventative action. The stage was set for a family tragedy that no one could have fully anticipated. Nick Reiner's early life was a mixture of promise and peril, of charm and danger, of love and conflict. Understanding this early period is crucial because it reveals the forces, both internal and external, that shaped the man who would ultimately commit a crime that shocked Hollywood and the world. It reveals the dynamics that made intervention extraordinarily difficult and highlights the emotional toll exacted on parents and siblings alike. Violence is often a warning, a signpost on the road to something far worse. In 2018, Nick Reiner delivered such a warning. An incident that would shake his family, alarm neighbors, and foreshadow a trajectory of chaos that ultimately culminated in the unimaginable. It was not a murder, not even a physical attack on a person, but the destruction he wrought was symbolic, a display of power, anger, and disregard that sent a clear message. He was unpredictable, uncontrollable, and capable of terrifying destruction. The incident began like so many others. A family evening disrupted by mood swings, arguments, and the creeping influence of substances. Nick, already struggling with addiction and unresolved resentments, reportedly destroyed the Reiners' guest house in a cocaine-fueled rage. Furniture was broken, walls damaged, and the very structure of the property bore the marks of his fury. Friends, neighbors, and even family members would later describe the scene as apocalyptic. Debris scattered across the floor, objects smashed without restraint, an atmosphere thick with fear and disbelief. It was the kind of behavior that signals a family crisis, one that could no longer be contained with a conversation, a gentle warning, or a promise to improve. For Rob and Michelle, this incident was a devastating reminder of the difficulty of managing a child whose intelligence, charm, and intensity were paired with volatility and self-destructive behavior. They had faced smaller confrontations before, heated arguments, outbursts of temper, and signs of substance abuse. But this destruction was not just emotional or psychological. It was physical, tangible, and irrevocable. It marked a crossing of a boundary that the Reiners had hoped would never be crossed. And yet, despite the severity, they approached it as they had approached every crisis, with intervention, concern, and a hope that Nick could be guided back to stability. The police were involved that night, documenting the destruction, but the legal consequences were limited. Charges were minimal, largely because the Reiners sought to handle matters internally. They prioritized family over legal action, seeking to preserve bonds while attempting to correct behavior. But this approach, while compassionate, may have reinforced patterns of behavior. By focusing on repair and forgiveness rather than accountability, the family allowed the volatility to persist without significant consequences. The incident also had emotional consequences that rippled through the family. Siblings, already accustomed to sharing attention with a troubled brother, were forced to confront the reality of his destructive potential. Fear mingled with frustration, creating an environment where normal interactions were tinged with caution. Every conversation, every family gathering, carried the unspoken awareness that Nick's mood could shift without warning, that the home could erupt into chaos at any moment. The parents, meanwhile, bore the emotional burden of managing not only Nick's behavior, but also the siblings' reactions, attempting to shield them from the full force of the disruption while simultaneously addressing the immediate damage. Friends and neighbors recall the aftermath vividly. The guest house, a separate structure designed for visitors, bore scars of the event for months, serving as a permanent reminder of the danger Nick could pose when fueled by substances and anger. The family, ever protective, attempted to restore normalcy quickly, but the psychological impact lingered. The destruction was not just of property. It was symbolic, a physical manifestation of the volatility and unpredictability that had long troubled the household. It was a warning that the family would struggle with for years to come, a foreshadowing of what might come next. Behavioral experts analyzing the case later noted that incidents like the 2018 destruction are rarely isolated. They are part of a pattern, a sequence of escalating behaviors that, without intervention, can lead to more severe outcomes. In Nick's case, the combination of substance abuse, untreated psychological issues, and long-standing familial resentment created a combustible mix. The 2018 incident demonstrated the intensity of his impulses, the extent of his anger, and the limits of the family's ability to contain it. Even after the event, attempts at rehabilitation and control were only partially effective. Rob and Michelle continued to intervene, seeking therapy, monitoring Nick's behavior, and attempting to set boundaries. But the lessons of 2018 revealed an important reality. Traditional methods of parenting, guidance, and intervention were insufficient for the level of volatility Nick exhibited. The family was in uncharted territory, navigating a child whose destructive impulses had escalated to dangerous levels, and whose intelligence and charm complicated attempts at accountability. It's also worth noting the psychological toll on Rob and Michelle. Years of patient parenting, guidance, and support were suddenly shadowed by fear and frustration. They had invested decades in fostering a family dynamic grounded in love, respect, and structure, only to see those efforts challenged in the most dramatic fashion. The incident was a stark reminder that love, while essential, has limits when confronted with unchecked aggression and addiction. The emotional strain of managing such a crisis cannot be overstated. Every parent facing similar circumstances can empathize with the sense of helplessness that accompanies watching a loved one spiral out of control. Siblings' perspectives were equally fraught. They had witnessed the chaos, felt the fear, and experienced the disruption firsthand. The destruction of the guest house was not just a property loss. It was an emotional event that forced them to confront the volatility of their brother and the limits of their parents' ability to manage him. It created an undercurrent of tension and mistrust that would influence family interactions for years. They were caught between loyalty to their brother and the need to protect themselves and their parents. The 2018 incident also drew attention from outside the family. Friends, colleagues, and neighbors could see that something was amiss. Rumors circulated, questions arose, and yet the family maintained a facade of normalcy, attempting to keep the details private while managing the immediate fallout. The combination of secrecy, public perception, and private fear created a tension that added another layer to the already complex family dynamics. From a behavioral standpoint, the destruction of the guest house can be seen as a tipping point. It revealed the depth of Nick's anger, the intensity of his substance abuse, and the potential for physical expression of his volatility. Experts would later suggest that patterns like these often escalate, if unaddressed, moving from property destruction to interpersonal violence. In this context, the incident was not just a warning. It was a symptom of a trajectory that, left unchecked, could end in catastrophe. What's chilling is how the family responded. Despite the severity, Rob and Michelle continued to intervene with love and hope. They sought counseling, set boundaries, and attempted to maintain household stability. The siblings, though frustrated, continued to support family efforts, trying to balance empathy with self-protection. Yet the very act of trying to restore normalcy may have inadvertently reinforced the patterns that would eventually culminate in tragedy. By prioritizing repair and reconciliation over firm boundaries and consequences, the family maintained the fragile equilibrium that, while sustainable in the short term, could not prevent escalation. Even years later, the memory of that night haunted those close to the family. It was a warning sign, a message of what could happen if the volatility continued unchecked. But warnings, no matter how clear, are only effective if they are heeded. And in the Reiner family, the combination of love, denial, and hope created a blind spot. The family focused on saving Nick, believing that with enough guidance and patience, the storm could be weathered. Unfortunately, some storms cannot be contained indefinitely. The 2018 incident, while devastating, was a turning point in the story of Nick Reiner. It was a clear manifestation of his capacity for destruction, a precursor to the ultimate tragedy that would later unfold. It demonstrated the limits of parental intervention, the fragility of family dynamics under strain, and the dangerous combination of addiction, mental health struggles, and unresolved resentment. It was a warning, one that the family, despite their efforts, would ultimately be unable to prevent from escalating. And yet, even as we examine this event, the question remains, could it have been averted? Could stronger boundaries, earlier intervention, or external support have changed the course of Nick's trajectory? Or was the pattern already set, the path toward catastrophe inevitable once certain dynamics were in place? These questions linger, haunting the narrative of the Reiners, and will continue to surface as we explore the events that followed. What is it like to live under the constant glare of fame when your family is struggling with secrets that could destroy you from within? For the Reiners, Hollywood was both a blessing and a curse. On the surface, Rob Reiner's life was enviable, a celebrated career, accolades, a household name whose work touched millions. But behind the lights, the premieres, and the accolades lay a household burdened by tension, secrets, and a son whose volatility threatened to dismantle everything. Hollywood is a world obsessed with perfection. Public appearances, media interviews, and social scrutiny create an environment where flaws are magnified and privacy is scarce. For Rob and Michelle, this meant that their family drama could never fully remain private. Neighbors, colleagues, and even casual acquaintances were aware, at least in part, of Nick's challenges. The family learned to navigate a delicate balance, presenting a facade of normalcy to the public while managing chaos behind closed doors. Every dinner party, every public outing, every award ceremony required careful choreography to avoid exposing cracks that could spiral into scandal. Rob Reiner, in particular, understood this balance. As a director and actor, he was accustomed to controlling narratives, managing perceptions, and guiding outcomes. He could craft compelling stories on screen, but struggled to control the unpredictability of life at home. Hollywood taught him the art of image, yet real life. The life of a family grappling with addiction and volatility refused to follow a script. The dichotomy was exhausting. The man who created order in the movies could not create order in his own household. For Michelle, the stakes were no less high. She had to maintain composure in public while constantly managing emotional crises at home. Her role extended beyond mother and wife. She became a mediator, crisis manager, and emotional anchor. The pressure to appear normal or even perfect to the outside world added layers of stress. Friends and acquaintances described Michelle as resilient and composed, but those close to her knew that the public image was only part of the story. Behind closed doors, she navigated tension, fear, and heartbreak daily. Nick's presence complicated the family's public life significantly. His volatility, combined with the family's attempts to shield him, required constant vigilance. Interviews, public events, and even casual social gatherings were fraught with anxiety. What if he had an outburst? What if his behavior attracted attention? What if, despite their best efforts, the facade crumbled? For the Reiners, every public moment carried an undercurrent of fear, a tension that outsiders could never perceive, but that shaped every interaction. The Hollywood culture itself contributed to the strain. In a world obsessed with appearances, admitting vulnerability or family struggles is often seen as weakness. For the Reiners, this meant that seeking help, speaking openly about Nick's challenges, or acknowledging the risk he posed was fraught with danger. The pressure to maintain a public image of success, composure, and family unity created a tension between honesty and preservation. Love and loyalty dictated that they protect their family, but the culture around them demanded performance, perfection, and secrecy. Industry insiders note that many Hollywood families grapple with similar dynamics. Fame magnifies flaws, complicates intervention, and isolates families from the support networks available to more private households. Friends may be hesitant to confront or intervene. Media scrutiny creates anxiety, and every misstep risks becoming a public spectacle. For the Reiners, these pressures layered on top of the existing family stress, amplifying the stakes of Nick's volatility and the parents' attempts at intervention. Despite the pressures, the family tried to maintain routines and a sense of normalcy. They attended premieres, celebrated milestones, and appeared together at events, projecting unity and happiness. Yet beneath the smiles and photos was a careful orchestration to manage Nick's behavior. Nick's adolescence and early adulthood coincided with critical moments in Rob's career. The demands of Hollywood, travel, filming schedules, and public engagements often conflicted with the needs of a household managing a troubled child. Rob's devotion to his craft sometimes left Michelle to navigate the immediate crises at home alone. This division of labor, though necessary, added strain to the marriage and household. Both parents were deeply committed, yet the sheer volume of challenges created stress that would accumulate over time. The siblings, too, were caught in the intersection of public and private pressures. They were expected to perform, to succeed, and to maintain composure while also navigating the chaos created by their brother. Many Hollywood children experienced similar pressures, but the intensity of Nick's behavior made the Reiner family's situation uniquely challenging. Loyalty, love, and fear created a web of emotional complexity that influenced every decision, interaction, and choice the family made in public and private spheres. Friends recall instances where public events were disrupted by Nick's mood swings or behavior. These incidents, though often contained, reinforced the precariousness of the family dynamic. Rob and Michelle learned to anticipate potential flashpoints, preparing scripts, responses, and interventions to prevent embarrassment or escalation. The effort was immense, emotionally exhausting, and continuous, a testament to the lengths the family went to protect both their son and their public image. Hollywood itself can be unforgiving. Rumors, gossip, and media scrutiny have the power to shape public perception, and any hint of dysfunction can become amplified. For the Reiners, this created a paradox. They had to shield Nick from exposure while also shielding themselves from judgment. Every decision, from seeking help to setting boundaries, was informed not just by family needs, but by the potential consequences of public knowledge. The family operated in a pressure cooker where private challenges were magnified by the glare of fame. Despite these pressures, moments of genuine connection and normalcy existed. Family dinners, vacations, and celebrations were attempts to anchor the household in stability. Friends noted that these moments, while sometimes fleeting, reflected the Reiners' commitment to love and cohesion. Yet these glimpses of normalcy also heightened tension. The more the family appeared fine to outsiders, the more private chaos seemed unsustainable. It was a fragile equilibrium, one that could collapse under the weight of Nick's escalating volatility. The Hollywood environment also amplified the consequences of failure. In a typical household, misbehavior can be managed quietly, consequences applied, and mistakes learned from. In the Reiner household, mistakes were magnified by public attention, industry connections, and the expectations of peers. This magnification increased the stakes for every action, every intervention, and every moment of volatility. The family was navigating both personal danger and reputational risk simultaneously, a dual challenge that few outside the industry could understand. For Nick, growing up in this environment may have exacerbated underlying issues. Fame and privilege can shield from immediate consequences, while also creating a distorted sense of self and entitlement. Combined with addiction and unresolved emotional trauma, these factors contributed to a pattern of behavior that became increasingly difficult to manage. The pressures of Hollywood, combined with family dynamics, created a feedback loop in which volatility was both amplified and, in some ways, tolerated as part of a complex system. Experts examining the case suggest that Hollywood families often face unique stressors that complicate intervention. The need to maintain appearances, the isolation from traditional support systems, and the magnification of minor crises into public spectacles create an environment where patterns of dysfunction can escalate unchecked. In the Reiner case, the intersection of public scrutiny and private volatility created a scenario in which the family's love and patience were tested to extremes, ultimately laying the groundwork for the tragedy to come. And yet, despite all the pressures, the family continued to strive for normalcy. Rob continued his career, Michelle maintained the household, and the siblings navigated adolescence and adulthood under extraordinary circumstances. Their efforts were heroic in their constancy, but the pressures of Hollywood, combined with Nick's escalating challenges, created a fragile situation. Every public appearance, every film premiere, every interview carried a subtext of tension, fear, and meticulous orchestration to prevent disaster. The Reiner family's public life was a constant balancing act, a tightrope walk over a chasm of potential chaos. And it was on that tightrope that the tragedy began to take shape, the pressures of Hollywood and family dynamics intersecting in a way that would soon culminate in heartbreak. How does a charming, intelligent child transform into an adult capable of unimaginable violence? The path is rarely linear, rarely simple. In Nick Reiner's case, addiction and rage became intertwined, creating a volatile mix that would ultimately overwhelm the family's ability to contain it. Understanding this process requires digging into both the psychological and behavioral patterns that escalated over years, the invisible forces that can turn love and patience into fear and desperation. Addiction is not just a habit, it is a reshaping of the brain, a distortion of priorities, and a magnification of impulses. For Nick, substance use started in adolescence, but grew into a persistent struggle as he reached adulthood. Friends and family observed early experimentation with drugs and alcohol, behaviors that might have been relatively benign in other circumstances. But Nick's intensity and emotional volatility transformed use into abuse. Cocaine, alcohol, and other substances amplified existing tendencies. Anger became rage, frustration became aggression, and impulsive decisions became destructive actions. Every high created temporary escape, but the aftermath left the family grappling with the consequences, often for days or weeks. The interplay of addiction and family dynamics is critical. In many cases, addiction functions as both a symptom and a catalyst, a manifestation of internal conflict and a driver of external chaos. In Nick's household, the consequences of his addiction were compounded by long-standing resentments and behavioral issues. Each relapse, each aggressive episode, reinforced patterns of intervention, repair, and forgiveness that ultimately enabled continued destructive behavior. The Reiners, motivated by love and hope, were caught in a cycle. They attempted to help, he resisted or lashed out, and they tried again, year after year, crisis after crisis. Violence was never abstract in Nick's life. By the time he reached his late 20s, reports indicate he had episodes of aggression that extended beyond verbal confrontations. The 2018 incident, in which he destroyed the family guest house, was a harbinger, a tangible manifestation of rage amplified by substances. But there were other, less visible moments, threats, intimidation, and manipulation that left family members walking on eggshells. These patterns were consistent, persistent, and increasingly dangerous. For the Reiners, love meant patience, but patience has limits, and each incident eroded the household's emotional resilience. Addiction also affects empathy and moral judgment. As substances altered his brain chemistry, Nick's ability to regulate emotion, foresee consequences, and respond rationally diminished. Family members observed shifts in behavior, a lack of remorse after destructive episodes, a tendency to blame others, and a growing disconnection from reality. His intelligence and charm, which once drew people in, now masked a dangerous instability. Friends who had known him for years described him as magnetic yet terrifying, someone whose moods could swing violently in an instant, leaving even the closest observers unsure of what to expect. The family's attempts at intervention illustrate a paradox faced by many parents of adult children with addiction. Love compelled them to act, but the tools available, therapy, rehabilitation programs, boundaries, often failed to produce lasting change. Rob and Michelle tried repeatedly to help Nick, investing resources, emotional energy, and patience. Yet every step forward was often followed by regression, every moment of calm replaced by an eruption of anger, destruction, or substance use. Over time, even the most loving interventions began to feel like a losing battle, a pattern that contributed to both family frustration and fear. Psychologists note that long-term exposure to this kind of volatility can have ripple effects across the entire household. Siblings often experience resentment, fear, and guilt simultaneously. Resentment at the disruption caused by the troubled sibling, fear of unpredictable outbursts, and guilt for feeling frustration towards someone who is struggling. In the Reiner household, this dynamic was compounded by Hollywood pressures, public scrutiny, and the parents' devotion to maintaining appearances. Every interaction carried the weight of history, the anticipation of volatility, and the tension of living with a person whose impulses could be explosive. The intensity of Nick's rage often seemed disproportionate to the situation. Minor frustrations could trigger extreme responses: shouting, property destruction, threats, or physical aggression. Substance use magnified these tendencies, turning occasional anger into sustained, dangerous episodes. For the family, predicting behavior became nearly impossible. They had to constantly monitor moods, anticipate triggers, and attempt preemptive interventions, a task that required emotional energy, constant vigilance, and, ultimately, sacrifices of their own well-being. One friend of the family described Nick's behavior as like living with a storm you can see coming but cannot stop. That analogy captures both the inevitability and the helplessness the family experienced. They could prepare as best they could, attempt interventions, and hope for the best, but the underlying forces, addiction, unresolved resentment, rage, were uncontrollable. It was a ticking time bomb, a combination of personal demons and external pressures that would eventually detonate. Even in moments of apparent calm, danger lingered. Addiction and rage are not confined to visible outbursts. They are internal states that shape perception, decision-making, and impulse control. Nick's intelligence and charm often masked underlying volatility, creating an environment where family members could never fully relax. Each calm moment was fragile, temporary, and uncertain, a brief pause before the next eruption. For Rob and Michelle, this meant that even love was shadowed by fear. For the siblings, it created a sense of constant alertness, a state of emotional hypervigilance that became a permanent aspect of daily life. Experts suggest that a combination of addiction and unresolved familial resentment can amplify risk factors for violent behavior. In Nick's case, the family history, parental interventions, and sibling dynamics all contributed to a complex psychological landscape. Patterns of favoritism, the disproportionate attention required by Nick, and the emotional consequences for the other children created a pressure cooker environment. Over time, these elements converged, producing a perfect storm of emotional, behavioral, and psychological instability. It is important to note that addiction alone does not determine destiny. Many individuals struggle with substance abuse without ever committing acts of violence. What made Nick's situation uniquely dangerous was the intersection of factors: untreated addiction, a history of aggression, unresolved psychological issues, familial dynamics, and the pressures of living in the public eye. Together, these created conditions in which violent impulses could, and ultimately did, manifest in the most devastating way. The 2018 incident, viewed through the lens of addiction and rage, becomes even more significant. It was not an isolated outburst, but a crystallization of years of escalating behaviors. It revealed the capacity for destruction, the intensity of rage, and the difficulty of containment. In retrospect, it can be seen as a milestone on the path to tragedy, a warning that, tragically, went unheeded in its ultimate implications. Even with interventions, therapy, and parental devotion, the forces driving Nick's behavior proved difficult to manage. Addiction, rage, and psychological instability created a pattern that reinforced itself, escalating with each incident. The family tried everything: rehabilitation programs, counseling, boundaries, and support. Yet every solution was temporary, every victory fleeting, and every eruption a reminder of the fragility of their efforts. As the pattern continued, the family's emotional resources were exhausted. Rob and Michelle, despite decades of devotion and expertise in managing public life, could not contain the storm indefinitely. Siblings, though resilient, were strained by years of unpredictability and emotional turbulence. The household existed in a state of fragile equilibrium, where love and fear coexisted, and every day required vigilance, negotiation, and compromise. And yet, even as the darkness intensified, there were moments of hope. Fleeting glimpses of the son they loved, the child they hoped to save, the person who could, perhaps, overcome his demons. These moments, while rare, sustained the family's efforts and kept them invested in a battle they could not yet see the end of. But as history would reveal, hope alone is not always enough to prevent catastrophe. The path from addiction and rage to tragedy is rarely straightforward, yet in Nick Reiner's case, it followed a pattern of escalation, warning signs, and unheeded boundaries. The seeds planted in childhood, nurtured by intelligence and charm but shadowed by volatility and addiction, grew into a force that ultimately overwhelmed even the most loving and vigilant family. It was supposed to be a quiet night, like so many others. Rob and Michelle Reiner, exhausted from the day's events, had finally settled into their routine. Perhaps they were watching television, perhaps exchanging a few words about the day, perhaps even thinking about the future, children grown, careers flourishing, life continuing in its seemingly predictable rhythm. But in one moment, all of that would change. The events of that night are horrifying not only for their brutality, but for the cold, deliberate nature of the attack. According to police reports and sources close to the family, Nick Reiner may have waited until his parents were asleep before committing an act so savage it defies simple comprehension. The alleged details are chilling: stab wounds inflicted with precision, slashed throats, and a level of violence that suggests premeditation. In that moment, a home that had been both sanctuary and stage of endless tension became a crime scene of unimaginable horror. To understand the magnitude, it's crucial to consider the family dynamic leading up to this night. Rob and Michelle had devoted decades to guiding and protecting their son, navigating his volatility, addiction, and rage. Every intervention, every therapy session, every attempt to maintain calm was rendered tragically insufficient. The family's love, patience, and hope, while extraordinary, could not override the culmination of years of untreated psychological and behavioral patterns. Nick's behavior leading up to the night reportedly escalated in alarming ways. Sources indicate he was found after the murders near a Santa Monica hotel, his room slathered in blood, the shower, the bed, every surface marked by the violence he had unleashed. This level of destruction mirrors earlier patterns, like the 2018 incident, but with a terrifying escalation. The target was no longer property, but the very people who had devoted their lives to him. Friends described Nick's trajectory as a slow-burning fuse, a combination of addiction, rage, and unresolved emotional trauma that finally detonated in a catastrophic act of violence. The symbolism of the attack is as chilling as the act itself. By allegedly targeting his parents while they slept, Nick was not just committing murder. He was silencing them, permanently shutting down the voices of authority, love, and guidance that had defined his life. It is an image of control, dominance, and rage that underscores the depth of the family tragedy. For Hollywood and the world beyond, the horror is magnified by the knowledge that these were not strangers or casual acquaintances, but parents, people whose devotion and care were met with incomprehensible violence. Nick's siblings reportedly had suspicions even before the crime was fully discovered. Romy, one of his sisters, is said to have told police she feared her brother had committed the act. That fear, born out of years of observing his volatility, was tragically validated. The siblings, who had lived under the shadow of Nick's behavior for decades, suddenly faced the ultimate nightmare: the loss of their parents in the most violent, intimate way imaginable. Their grief is compounded not only by loss but by the fact that the perpetrator was their own brother, a figure whose struggles they had witnessed and perhaps even tried to help. The psychological implications of this night are staggering. Families often experience cycles of abuse, volatility, and intervention that, if unbroken, can escalate to catastrophic outcomes. In the Reiner household, the convergence of addiction, untreated rage, and familial stress created conditions where a single night could unravel a lifetime of love, patience, and structure. The horror lies not only in the act itself, but in the years of escalating dynamics that made such an act tragically plausible. Nick's alleged actions were not impulsive in the typical sense. Reports suggest a level of deliberation. Waiting until his parents were asleep, choosing lethal methods, and leaving evidence that highlighted the violence. This indicates premeditation, a grim departure from earlier incidents of destructive behavior that had primarily targeted property or provoked fear without crossing into lethal territory. It is the stark